You can start.
Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. My name is Mihraj, and I'm a research fellow at CIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. We are pleased to welcome all of you in our 41st book discussion session. I would like to sort of offer a little bit of a background, after which, inshallah, Professor Katrin is going to talk about her book, The Idea of Ummah. Nabi alayhi salatu wasalam, in one of his hadith, said, Al-Muslimuna karajulin, aw Al-Muslimuna kal ummatin jasdin wahid. In ishtaqa aynuhu, ishtaqa kulluhu, wa in ishtaqa ra'suhu, ishtaqa kulluhu. The ummah is one body. If one part is suffering, the whole body feels the pain. What we see right now transpiring in Palestine, and to be specific in Gaza, and the sort of rallying cry which has emerged from the Muslim world and from Muslims across trans-territorial boundaries, sort of pinches us to the core and has evoked this discussion of how do we think of Muslim Ummah in the contemporary world, and how we look at the West, at the Western secular liberal order. Before I introduce Professor Katrin, I would like to offer a brief note from a recently published article by Hassan Spiker. Hassan Spiker is a professor from Cambridge. He wrote an article recently titled The Terminal Hypocrisy of a Crumbling West and the Dawning of a New Age for Muslims. He wrote, following on from a long chain of painful shocks, chief amongst them the war on terror, the October 7th war constitutes the final death blow to any vain hope of saving this flagship moral claim of liberalism from ultimate and intrinsic failure. It has, like no event before it, fully exposed liberal secular societies' much wanted diversity of cultural and intellectual expression as no more than appearance. For a futile moment after October 7th, the Western powers attempted their own moral resuscitation by again invoking the time-honored narrative of their moral saviorhood, only for it to fatally backfire this time and only serve instead to demonstrate their terminal moral illegitimacy. Western genocide apologism after October 7th has forever imprinted in our hearts and minds all that makes the declining, flailing, post-Enlightenment West so dangerous. Its lack of any stable, unnegotiable morality for anything can be countenanced in that dismal anti-ethics of post-morality, the calculus of survival. While offering this background, talking about Katrin's book becomes all too urgent and becomes all too important, and also contextual, and also contemporaneous. Today, as I mentioned, we have invited Professor Katrin Jomaa to talk about her book, Ummah, A New Paradigm for a Global World. Professor Katrin works as an assistant professor at the University of Rhode Island with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and Philosophy. Katrin's interdisciplinary research interests and encompasses classical and modern political philosophy, as well as Islamic thought and Quranic exegesis, especially focusing on the interrelationship between religion and politics in the Middle East. Her research method employs analysis of Islamic primary sources to explore key concepts which could be utilized in constructing modern Islamic political theory. Besides her interest in the field of humanities, Dr. Jomaa has a dual passion for science and technology. She has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from the American University of Cairo and a master's degree in applied material sciences from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Her scientific background has informed her study of religion and politics as she employs structural analysis to the understanding of religious texts and political events. Professor Katrin, we are really honored to have you with us today. We would like you to, inshallah, start your presentation. Jazakumullah khair.
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for inviting me. I think I lost you. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, I don't know where.
Yeah, you'll be on the main screen now.
Yes. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honored by that. I'm very happy to share with you the findings of my book, Thank you for inviting me. I'm just going to make actually 4 more points in the beginning to talk about the vision or the goals or what I'm trying to represent in my book before delving into the details. The first thing, reducing Islam to religion, I think, is a big reduction. In the modern discourse, religion is a set of rituals followed by people, mainly in private, or an ideology, like a personal ideology. I'm trying to show in my book that Islam is actually a way of life, a way of understanding how to organize society and how to conduct politics and how to view the world. So this is one thing that I'm trying to show in my book. The second thing is also in the modern discourse, there is a very strict binary division between private and public, between secular and religious. Another thing that I'm challenging in this book is actually to show that this demarcation is not clearly defined in Islam. There's a lot of fluidity, a lot of interrelation, and actually the private mirrors the public, and the secular and religious are intertwined. A third thing I'm also aiming to present or to show in this book is my use of Quranic or primary sources. I'm focused on what scholars call normative Islam instead of historical Islam. So the historical Islam is the Islam that's constructed by jurists historically. It's not that I'm completely disregarding that, but I'm more focused on normative Islam represented in the Quran itself and the Seerah or the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. Because I'm trying to sort of re-understand or see what the Quran is trying to tell us and the prophetic practice through the lens of the modern time. So more, it is sort of a fresh reading with a modern perspective. I'm still, of course, consulting history by using different exegetical works, so different tafasir from the 3rd century and from the modern period. So I'm using 2 scholars from the 3rd century and 3 mufassirin from the modern period. And this is how I sort of include some historical references. But my focus is on the Quran and the Sunnah. The fourth thing I'm also using, or thinking about is my point in this book is how can we find in this Islamic heritage represented by the Quran and the Sunnah, how can this heritage respond to current challenges and offer solutions to current problems? That's my whole point of the book. And this is why I'm introducing the Ummah as sort of an alternative concept to the modern nation state. And how can the Ummah offer solutions to this concept or this entity that we sort of practice in the modern world? The second part of my book, the first part is focused on the Quranic exegesis and the Sunnah. The second part, I'm comparing the Ummah with the Aristotelian polis. So my aim is to have a cross-cultural dialogue in which Islamic and Western civilizations talk to each other. Then we can bring this Islamic heritage into living interaction with other ideas and other cultures. I'm just gonna share. Am I sharing the screen now?
Yes.
Yeah, I just can't see sorry about that.
That's okay.
So I'm just gonna bring my presentation. I don't know why I can't keep the presentation open for some reason. Sorry again.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
Challenges facing nation states.
Can you just click on the yeah, yes, yeah, perfect. No, on the yeah, perfect.
Okay. So when we talk, you mentioned Israel and Palestine, and I think it's very important. I'm actually going to give vivid examples about the nation state and the construction of the nation state using this example. The problem of the modern nation state is essentially moral, as I'm using the words of Wa al-Hallaq in his book, The Impossible State. There's no restriction on the sovereign will. The sovereign will ideally should represent the popular will, the will of the people. And under the rule of law, the sovereign will represents the popular will. And this is how it gains a sovereignty, but there's no restriction on it. I'm going to give an example. If you look at today, 68% of the American public want a ceasefire in Gaza. 68%. That's the biggest majority from both the Democrats and Republicans. And the war has been going on for 40-something days today. But the sovereign is not listening to the will of the people, while the sovereign should be actually implementing and representing the will of the people. So here there's no restriction on the sovereign will. There is no restriction on the use of violence or force by the sovereign. Again, if you look at Israel today bombing Gaza using illegal weapons that are prohibited by international law, white phosphorus bombs, and it's bombing hospitals, civilians, ambulances. So this is all against international law, and people are screaming all over the world that this should not be happening. Again, there is no restriction on the use of force by the sovereign. Why? Because the sovereign, under the law, its will represents the popular will. So this is also a moral dilemma. Another problem is forced homogenization. So for the nation state to actually come into place, you need to have a homogeneous population, which is homogenized by a common culture, by a flag, by some values. I mean, that's the best part of it. The worst part of it is also what you saw in Palestine, that when the Jews or the Zionists came in, they expelled the Palestinians, they created refugees, they killed a huge number and amounts of Palestinians in order to bring about this Zionist state, which is homogeneous, which is, only Jewish. So or Zionist rather than Jews, because we have to make a distinction between Jews and Zionists. Not all Jews are Zionists, obviously. But the idea of the nation state is this forced homogenization, which causes a lot of atrocities, not only in Palestine, Israel, but this happened all over the globe as well, this kind of idea of forced homogenization. So what I'm trying to do with my book is actually by exploring the Ummah and understanding the Ummah, how can the Ummah or the Islamic paradigm offer us solutions to these problems that are, created by the construction of and the implementation of the modern nation states. Another important factor that I'm showing in this slide is that the globalization that we're facing today, the growth of multicultural societies, right? So today we're turning into a very small world, it's a global village. There is lots of ease of communication, ease of receiving of information. As you see what was happening today in Gaza, we're receiving it in the minute, by the minute. People are, the tweets, the social, it's really rapid and increasing. So this growth of multiculturalism or multicultural societies, actually Western scholars are saying that it's very hard to contain that within the traditional framework of nation states. So this is posing a challenge. And also the globalization of commerce, eco-production, spread of technology and weapons and all of that. From the Middle Eastern perspective, obviously the nation state came into existence through the colonial powers. They enforced it, they put it in place without taking into consideration also the diversity of the Middle East, ethnic, religious, and you name it, the immense diversity of the Middle East. So it's a problem. If we look at the Muslim responses to these challenges, some responses have been state-centric. The most famous is the one espoused by the Muslim Brotherhood, political activism within the structure of the nation state. So you keep the nation state in place, but you try to reform the system from within through political activism. There are other, responses that were done by Daesh and Qaeda, through violence and terror to restore the caliphate. And this has been national and transnational. Another responses have been the people-centric, I call it not state-centric, exemplified by the Arab Spring, the uprisings, or the peoplehood, in which non-state actors actually went into the streets and they revolted against, the people in power by the nation states. And I think that what we saw in the Arab Spring, I think it's a clear example of what happens when the Ummah takes on some political power or political relevance. Now I'm going to go, so I have this sort of general introduction. I want to go into the book objectives. My book, I try to do the two things. The first half of the book is trying to uncover the different meanings and layers of the word Ummah in the Quran in order to understand its socio-political significance and function. That's the first aim. The second aim is also understanding Islamic socio-political ethics. What's the Islamic paradigm concerning socio-political ethics related to the role of the human being, community in politics, pluralism, law, and justice? The structure of the book, I have three main parts. The first is Quranic interpretation, the first two chapters. I start with the Meccan verses, and then I move to the Medinan verses. And the Meccan verses were revealed chronologically before the Medinan verses. So as I said, I look at different exegetical works from the 3rd century and from the modern period in order to try to understand what does the Quran tell us about the Ummah? How does the Quran want us to understand the Ummah? Okay. And then the second part is a historical analysis in which I look at the prophetic seerah and check whether, how can we see what the Quran is saying implemented in the prophetic life historically and practically. And also check the validity of my conclusions that I reached through the Quranic interpretation. After doing that, I move into philosophical and political comparison, which is, I consider, the second half of my book, in which I compare the concept of the Ummah with the Aristotelian polis, or the political community of Aristotle. And by doing this, I'm trying to sort of use the Aristotelian political method in order to understand, the sort of involvement of politics of the Ummah, and how we can understand it politically. Now, the first chapter, I call it Conceptual Ummah in the Meccan verses of the Quran. Why do I call it conceptual? Because there is no mention of Muslim Ummah in the Meccan verses of the Quran. No mention of the Muslim Ummah. The Muslim Ummah will appear only in the Medinan verses, not in the Meccan verses. So I say that what I reached from my research is that Ummah in the Meccan verses is represented as a concept that is not related specifically to any historical group of people or denomination, and not related to religion. My conclusion about the Quranic verses is that the foundation of the concept of the Ummah is founded upon the concept of the book, al-kitab, and not deen or religion. And this book could be religious, could be the Quran, could be the Torah, could be the Bible, or it could be a secular book or any book. So the Ummah as a concept is founded on the book and the covenant, al-mithaq. And people join the Ummah by choice, and they have a responsibility. The secondary to this concept of the Ummah, according to my research, is the Imam, the legislator, or the political leader, and the territory. These are secondary, I think. The foundational is the concept of the book and covenant. And according to that, Ummah, when we say Ummah today, we automatically think of the Muslim Ummah, right? That's what we think of today. I think based on the Quran and the Mecca verses, Ummah is not equivalent to the Muslim Ummah. So you have to add Muslim actually to make it the Muslim Ummah. So you could have Ummat Ahl al-Kitab, any kind of Ummah, right? Ummah does not equal to Muslim Ummah by default. So what's an ummah? An ummah is an active community. It's dynamic that is always seeking unity based on its book of guidance, which forms the backbone of it. It's composed of purposeful individuals covenanted to establish a particular way of life. The covenant is very important because when you enter a covenant, then you have a responsibility upon entering it to fulfill specific role. So that's very important. Now, if we move into the Ummah in the Medinan verses of the Quran, as I said, the Muslim Ummah appears for the first time in the Quran in the Medinan verses and in relationship to Prophet Abraham, when he prayed for the rise of, or the coming of Prophet Muhammad and the rise of this Muslim Ummah that will come later in time. I think that, Muslim as a term, as a concept, as an ideology, obviously is since the beginning of time, since Adam. So it appears in the Meccan verses and the Medinan verses. But the Muslim Ummah is a historical entity and as a group of people will only appear after the coming of Prophet Muhammad. And it has specific attributes, specific characteristics, and a specific function. And I think it comes later in history because the Ummah or the people have reached a level of spiritual and mental maturity for it to come into place. What are the attributes of the Muslim Ummah? I say here the Muslim Ummah compared to other Ummah before it has an attribute of being wasat. Wasat is interpreted by scholars as moderate or middle or just, and also has the attribute of the best. Kuntum khayra umma ukhrijat linnas is the best ummah because of its wasatiyya, which I will interpret politically how we can reach this wasatiyya. And it's a witness to other ummah. It acts as a shaheed, as a witness. So obviously this Muslim ummah is not enclosed on itself. It's not a closed community. It's an open community. It has to be open for it to witness to other ummah and other people. And it has a specific function, which is enjoining righteousness and deterring wrongness. يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَيُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ, and while believing in God. So it has a specific function. So this Muslim ummah will only appear after the coming of Prophet Muhammad. It follows the precedence of Prophet Muhammad in its characteristic and in following and in its role. And I'll clarify more what I mean by that. So as I said, the characteristics and the function of the Muslim Ummah necessitated it being the last Ummah sent to humankind because it's embracing of previous religions and accepts the different other as a divine ordained reality. This is unprecedented in history that a religious group, part of its ideology as a religion, as a religious ideology, is accepting the religious other, okay? From a political and a socio-political perspective. And in my book, I make a distinction between the Muslim Ummah and the Islamic Ummah. So the Muslim Ummah is the Ummah that follows the Quran as a book and as a Sharia and as a way of life. It goes by the Quran in its totality. So they follow the Islamic ethics, and they also follow they follow Muslim rituals and Muslim ibadat and all of that. So this is the Muslim Ummah. The Islamic Ummah is a wider Ummah, is more encompassing, more embracing. It embraces other religious into it. So under it comes, for example, the Jewish Ummah with its own book and its own law, and comes the Christian Ummah with its own book and its own law. So it's pluralistic, it's wider, and the Muslim Ummah is invited to take the lead to establish this wider and bigger pluralistic Islamic Ummah. Like the Prophet was invited to do that, the Muslim Ummah after him is invited to establish this bigger pluralistic Islamic Ummah. If you look at the constitution of Medina, and now I'm looking at the historical precedents, when Prophet Muhammad established the first Ummah in history, in Islamic history, was in Medina, when he and his followers immigrated to Medina and they established this political treaty with the natives of Medina. and also with the Jews of Medina, who were in war for more than 100 years. So the Prophet established a political treaty, or Sahifat al-Madina, or they call it the Constitution of Medina, which actually organizes the relation between those people, and also establishes the Ummah for the first time in history. If you look at the decrees, the first decree starts with, this is a book, هذا كتاب, from Prophet Muhammad, the messenger of God, between the believers, the Muslims, and the people of Yathrib, and those who follow them, join them, and strive along with them. The second decree says, they are one ummah apart from the people. So here, again, what defines this ummah is al-kitab, right? And obviously this kitab here is not only Muslim, right? It's Islamic. Why? Because if we fast forward into Decree 25, in the same treaty, it says the Jews of Bani Auf, together with the believers, constitute an ummah. The Jews having their religion and law, and the Muslims having their religion and law. So here, we're embracing, the Prophet embraced the Jews as part of this ummah. Okay? So this is what I mean by there's the Muslims and there is the wider Islamic ummah, which is embracing of the other and embracing of diversity, including religious diversity. The treaty starts with the book from Muhammad and it ends, the last decree 47, it says, this book shall not protect the perpetrator of an unjust act or a crime. So again, my conclusion in the Meccan verses is that the book forms the backbone of the ummah, and I think this is confirmed in the prophetic practice. And I draw like a small sketch here that the Ummah of Medina that was established by Prophet Muhammad started with the Muslims here. They are the core of this Ummah, and it expanded to include the Jews, the protected persons, the allies, okay? And if we're thinking of the modern period, I think it's the same idea that the Muslims are supposed to lead this kind of wider pluralistic and diverse ummah. Okay. One of the distinctive features of in the Islamic paradigm about the ummah is the introduction of legal pluralism. That's extremely important. Why? Because you deal with the problem that I mentioned earlier, which is the forced homogenization of people that is followed in the modern nation state, forced homogenization, in which you do not account for diversity other than the private sphere, and you have one law that is enforced usually by the elite who enforce this law. In the Islamic paradigm, the system is different. You have legal pluralism in which each community has the right to follow their own law. And by that regard, you are negating this forced homogenization. You do not need homogenization in the public sphere, okay? This is something that is legal and public, not only private, okay? And you allowing diverse people who have a divine right or a godly right to practice their own religion the way that they see fit. Okay, so this is extremely important, and this makes a critical shift in the Islamic paradigm when we're thinking about constructing the social and political construction of societies. Here the Quranic verses say, humankind were one single ummah, then God sent messengers with glad tidings and warnings, and with them he sent the book in truth to judge between people in matters wherein they differed. So the book has the role of dealing with those differences. And again, the Quran is talking specifically to Prophet Muhammad in this verse, and to you, meaning Prophet Muhammad, we reveal the scripture in truth, which is the Quran, confirming the scripture that came before it, meaning the Bible and the Torah, and muhaymin, trustworthy in highness and a witness over it. And then the Quranic verse continues, I cut it to make the point clear. To each among you, we have prescribed a law in a clear way. لِكُلٍّ مِّنْكُمْ جَعَلْنَا شَرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. So each group are allowed to follow their law, right? If God has willed, he would have made you one ummah in a sense that you are united, you're homogenized, but obviously you're not all the same, you're different, and it's fine. The point is to test you in what he has given you, so compete with one another in good works. The return to you, of all of you, is to God. Then he will inform you about in which you still differ. This verse resonates or complements what the Prophet did in the Medina through the Sahifat al-Medina, that he invited the Jews with their own law, and they are part of this bigger pluralistic ummah in which obviously the Muslim ummah takes the lead, or the Prophet takes the lead in this in that regard. Another point that I make also in relationship to that is that the Prophet Muhammad specifically, apart from the other prophets, is described as the Ummi Prophet in the Quran. Now, the traditional exegetical tafsir of what the Ummi Prophet means is that the Prophet does not read or write, and the Prophet was Gentile, so he didn't know about previous scriptures, mainly the Torah and the Bible, which is definitely, I'm not against this definition. I think it's the classical definition. We all go by it. But I'm adding an added layer to that definition. Ummi and Ummah obviously have the same root. So I thought, could it be possible that the Prophet is described by Ummi because he's also related to his Ummah and also related to a global Ummah? There is one sentence in a tafsir of Tabari in which he says there is a possibility that the Prophet is described as an Ummi in the Quran because he's related to the Ummah, but he doesn't explain why. So I sort of ventured into this, and I think that I'm making, the argument or the suggestion that the Prophet Muhammad is described as an Ummi because, one, he is related to his Ummah as a very, very organic relationship. The Quran says that you are the best ummah because you enjoin righteousness and deter wrongness and believe in God. يَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ وَيُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ. And this is the same function that is given to Prophet Muhammad, that he enjoins righteousness and deter wrongness. So that's a relationship. And also that the Muslim ummah is supposed to carry out the message of the Prophet after his leaving this world. So they carry the same message. And also in the Quran, God says that he supported the Prophet with the believers, right, who are supposed to carry this message. So the very strong relationship between the Prophet and his Ummah. And there is also a strong relationship between the Prophet Muhammad and the global Ummah, or the global world. And you find it in these two verses. It says, those who follow the messenger, the Ummi Prophet, whom they find mentioned in their own scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel. So the people of previous, religions find Prophet Muhammad mentioned in their own scriptures. And also in the same regard, Prophet Muhammad, if you look at this verse, I have to go back. Yeah, here the verse say, O humankind, ayyuhan nas, verily I'm sent to you all as the messenger of Allah, right? And then it continues, so believe in Allah, his messenger, the Ummi Prophet, who believes in God and his words. So Prophet Muhammad believes in God and his words, so believe in the people, in the prophets before him and the words of God before him. And in the same regard, the people also of the previous prophets find the Prophet mentioned in their own scriptures. So there is a reciprocal relationship again between the Prophet and other people from previous religions. So this is why I'm saying that there is a relationship between the Ummi Prophet and the global Ummah. So I made this small, simple sketch that sort of summarizes what I've just said. So people originally were one Ummah, and then they diversified into Ummah 1, Ummah 2, Ummah 3, which is natural. We're gonna be diverse. It's God's plan. It's natural. It's inevitable. This happens. We're not supposed to homogenize people. We're not supposed to make everybody the same. That's not the point, and that's not the Quranic narrative or the Quranic invitation. However, what we are supposed to do as a global community is to take the lead in creating some kind of unity or a global ummah through covenants. through covenants. So these Ummah come together through covenants, okay? And Prophet Muhammad, who's the Ummi prophet, right, is sent to this global Ummah of diverse communities and encourage them to seek unity through establishing covenants and competing in good works by following their respective laws. And obviously, the Muslim Ummah is the follower of Prophet Muhammad, so it should take the lead in creating that kind of a global Ummah, which is united through covenants. Now, I'm moving now fast. How much time do I have left? Like 10 minutes? Mihraj? I'm just asking, how much time do I have left? Are you guys hearing me? Okay. Okay, I'll just go on. So the last part of my book is about the political role of the Ummah. And I use Aristotle, as I said. Aristotle describes the human being as a political animal who has an inherent need for political association using language. The Quran describes the human being as a Khalifa, is somebody who rules, or somebody who follows, somebody who succeeds, who cultivates the earth. So God created this ennobled creature who's supposed to cultivate this earth, dwell on this earth, and, you know, flourish and, you know, build this kind of earth. But his political growth is inherently connected to spiritual growth. They both come together. So again, the private and the public mirror each other. Secular and religious are sort of interconnected. So I think that how the Quran describes the Khalifa, I try to make in my book the argument that it's sort of a holistic understanding of the human being. It's not only a reduction to just a political animal or even just an animal. The Quran does not describe the human being as an animal by any sense. And the aim of the political animal for Aristotle is the perfect life based on choice and action, which should lead to happiness. So it seems like it's a very individualistic aim. While in the Quran, the aim of the Khalifa is using choice and using action to enhance his life and the life of everyone and the life of all creation. So in the Quran, the Khalifa is not only privileged by having the free will and having the mind and the intellect and the language, but he's also given a duty and an obligation to use these privileges for his best and the best of mankind and the best of the earth and the environment and everything. So it's a more holistic understanding of the Khalifa of the human being in the Quran. Now, achieving justice. Aristotle says that in order to achieve justice, you need people to publicly deliberate and discuss and to have diversity and to have difference of opinion. He thinks that a healthy society is a society in which you see diversity and you see discussion, right? A controlled society is a society in which there is no discussion, no diversity, is sort of homogeneous. He says homogeneous societies are a sign of dictatorships, okay? So, and he says that the best law is the common interest, or is the common interest in which people deliberate in public about what is the best for them. Now, from the Quranic perspective, there is the concept of the shura, and also there is this concept of diversity. If you look at these verses, the Quran, in order, to present the justice or just leadership, the Quran contrasts it with the taghut. The taghut is a dictatorship or a tyranny or the rule for the private interest. The taghut is not interested in seeing any opposition. The taghut is not interested in law. The taghut makes one law, it makes its own law, and does not want to see any opposition or any difference or any public deliberation. It's the private interest. So here the Quran, by contrasting the taghut with the just leadership, it sort of clarify what is justice. And the second verse here, it says, I'm underlining it, obey God, obey the messenger, and those from among you who have been entrusted with authority, ulil amri minkum. And if you disagree over any matter, refer it to God and the messenger. So here you're going to obey those entrusted with authority, but disagreement is going to come. Has to be disagreement for a healthy society to flourish. What do you do when this happens? You refer it back to Sharia, you refer it back to God's law. So what is sovereign here is not the people who are entrusted with authority, is not the majority. The sovereign here is God's law, which is the Sharia. Okay? And obviously the Taghut is not interested in that kind of difference, and is not interested in law. So this is how the Quran shows the idea of justice. I make here sort of a simple sketch to talk about the socio-political structure of the Muslim Ummah. Other than diversity, which I already talked about, and the absence of forced homogeneity, the sketch here shows the Sharia is supreme and is sovereign. So in the modern nation state, the legislators are the sovereign because they are the ones who make the law. But in Islam, the Islamic paradigm, it's the other way around. It's God's law is sovereign, and the legislators interpret the law. The executive implement the law, and all of these are part of the Ummah. And obviously people, follow the law. And also the law is not just positive law as is understood in the modern context, but it is part of the social fabric of the society. Sharia is embedded in the social norms. Sharia is a public norm, okay? And because it's a public norm, it allows for this arrow, I make it two sides, that there is interaction between the people and the legislators. There has to be common interaction. And what is this interaction? It is al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa-nahy anil munkar, or what I call it active justice. There has to be this kind of back and forth between those two. And when you achieve that, you achieve this kind of equilibrium or wasatiyya, in which you prevent the tyranny of the legislators, or you prevent the tyranny of the majority, or the tyranny of the executive. When you have this equilibrium in this dynamic society who are constantly engaging in amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. Here I have the arrows that, going back and forth between legislators and the Ummah, between the executive and the Ummah. I make it one-sided from the legislators to the executive because the legislators are represented by the ulama, the fuqaha, the people who are very knowledgeable about the Sharia, and who sort of inspire the executives and how to create the society and implement it inspired by the Sharia. So again, what I'm trying to sort of say in this system, that when we talk about that there's no restriction on the sovereign will in the modern nation state. There's no restriction on the use of force or violence in the modern nation state. The forced homogenization. How do we solve these issues? So by proposing this model, I'm saying that actually, when you have this equilibrium system and this active community and active justice, you create a system in which you try to avoid that kind of having no restriction on anybody. So everybody is in the system restricted, and the only sovereign is actually God, represented in God's law. Just to sort of wrap up, I think I've spent most of my time. So the nation state, there is this obsession with avoiding conflict and forced homogeneity and superficial unity. From the Ummah perspective or the Islamic paradigm, diversity is natural. Conflict is inevitable. There is no need to force homogeneity in the public sphere. Minorities in the nation state feel no sense of belonging, and they are alienated by the law of the majority. In an Ummah paradigm, there is legal pluralism. Okay, so you don't feel this sense of alienation because you're not following the law of the majority, you're also following your own law, and you assign duties and obligations to diverse groups. In a nation-state system, there is a fragmented society sundered by competing private interests. In an Ummah paradigm, the public mirrors the private, and the Quran, there's an invitation to compete in your good works or compete in your respective laws, rather than just compete in private interests. In a nation-state, there is an absence of a common good, because people, other than giving elections or passing a bill, people are not really talking about their common good because they are, individualized. But in an Ummah paradigm, there is a binding, legitimate consensus. So instead of imposing a system with its own values, people come together and establish a binding, legitimate consensus. In a nation-state, there is a highly centralized system in which individual rights are prioritized, and by that, the citizens are discouraged from participating in the public discourse about the common good. But in an Ummah paradigm, this idea of enjoining righteousness and deterring wrongness, which I call it the act of justice, it is important for, the thriving of the Khalifa from a religious, social, and political perspective, and for maintaining the common good. So a global order based on the Ummah is sustained by constant interaction, interdependence based on covenants, and porous borders. The borders are not clearly demarcated in an Ummah setting, and there is a closer connection between the Ummah, not merely within the borders. So I'm going to stop here and open it for Q&A. I'm sorry for taking more than the time allocated to me, and thank you for allowing me to discuss, my ideas with you.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much for your overarching discussion on the idea of Ummah. While I was reading your book, and I think that also appears to be a part of your presentation and your slides. So I was looking at a few things, and I was thinking about a few things. One is, when you look at the idea of Ummah, especially when we talk about, you mentioned Wael Hallaq, which I really admire his work, and I also think through that prism of Wael Hallaq's book Impossible State, and especially the work of Salman Sayyid. So you talk about this contestation between the Islamists and the nation state, and you offer this idea of peoplehood in your book. You mentioned the idea of peoplehood in your book. So I was, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I was wondering, while we know how, as Wael Hallaq also mentions in one of his last chapters in the book, Technologies of the Self, where he talks about the construction of this new citizen, which has appeared in the state. I want to take this discussion more into what is happening right now in the world and make it more contemporary. So how do you look at the idea when you compare nation state and the implications of being a citizen of a nation state and the restrictions it imposes on you? And while you compare this with the idea of Ummah, in howsoever form you have conceptualized that idea of Ummah, which I have certain bit of reservations as well, but still, if we take that for granted, how do you imagine that an idea of Ummah can be conceptualized and also actualized by the idea of peoplehood? Do you think the idea of peoplehood is enough to be a sort of point of a point where we can all gather together and think of this idea of Ummah? Is it possible? And how do you see that, considering what is happening and considering what is happening in the Muslim world or in the world in general?
So you mean the peoplehood that, for example, people today are protesting and demonstrating against what's happening in Gaza, for example? That's what you're talking about?
As you mentioned, for example, as you mentioned Arab uprising as a point of contention, that a new sort of political manifestation has emerged in the Muslim world in the form of peoplehood, to conceptualize Islam and politics beyond nation state. So how do you think that can be actualized? How do you see that vis-a-vis the idea of Ummah?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So what happened, the Arab Spring or the peoplehood, what happened in the Arab Spring, I think is a start, is a beginning. that people went into the streets and they took the role of Khilafah into their own hands, and they voiced their opinion, and they voiced what they want, and I think in that regard they were enjoining the good and deterring the wrong, right? Because they are taking the role, they're being a Khalifa in action. So I think this happened, and it managed to topple dictators at one point, but it did not continue. It did not fully materialize. Why? Because you only have one component. When I talk about the Ummah, I mention about different components. There is the people, the idea of the Khalifa, but there's also the book, there is the covenant, right? There is the leadership. So there are many aspects of the Ummah of the peoplehood that are missing to have the complete picture. So people went into the streets, right? And they wanted to topple dictators, which is great. But then what is next? What is the book that you want to abide by? What are the values that you are proposing, okay, in order to establish this Ummah? What is the covenant that you want to make? Who is the leader? Who is the leader? There needs to be a leadership for this to be implementable, right? So when these aspects of the Ummah are missing, the Arab Spring did not fully materialize. That's what I see of it. So my work helps in, sort of complementing this image, or complementing or adding, or clarifying how can we actually reach to the full realization of this Ummah. Okay. And after even having, a covenant and a leadership and all of that, there needs to be a system that keeps everybody in check to prevent this kind of no restriction on the sovereign or no restriction on the use of power. That's why also I propose this dialogue or the system in which you have this continuing. So it's not only a specific moment where people riot or go against their powers to topple dictators. No, this is a continuing system, so it has to be also institutionalized in institutions and made as a practice. Obviously, I haven't thought about how to exactly do that, but at least I have the idea.
Right. Thank you so much.
And also, I also wanted to make another point that what we saw in the Arab Spring, we are seeing a similar manifestation today across the world, when a lot of people across the world from different religions, different backgrounds, different, you name it, are protesting against the genocide of Gaza. So that's why I say the Ummah as an idea is based in Islamic ethics and Islamic ideology, but it does not only apply to Muslims, it applies to the world. So what we're talking about here applies to Muslims, and it also applies to everybody else, and everybody else will resonate with it, because at the end of the day, when God created the human being as a Khalifa, everybody is a Khalifa if they want to take that role, right? So it has resonance not only in the Muslim world, but global wide.
But do you also see sort of when you offer this idea, and it seems there seems to be a smell, a sort of secular leanings also in a way that, for example, there are also certain, I would say, if I would use the word exclusivist claims or exclusivist principles, for example, the idea of zimmitude in Islam, for example, how do you conceptualize the idea of dhimma, or how do you actualize the idea of dhimma, or the whole, as you mentioned, that you are not focusing much on the legal corpus, you're focusing on the normative corpus of Islam, which in a way helps you to build your argument. But at the same time, the overarching content of the whole Islamic tradition sort of does have certain orthodox exclusivism, which we'll find there. So how would you think that considering the Turas of Islamic law or Islamic tradition, how do you think that the idea of Ummah can be navigated through this terrain, where you also see certain exclusive claims of how do you define the idea of Ummah, especially in
Okay, also very good question. So, and I was asked this question before. So within the Muslim Ummah, you will find the legal implementation. You'll find Ahl al-Dhimma within the Muslim Ummah, okay? But outside other ummahs, if you want to establish a global order where like other people also endorse this ideology, they have their own law and their own way of doing things, and they have covenants with the Muslim Ummah. But the exclusivity will be within the lands of the Muslim Ummah, where Muslims are the majority, or are the right. Because at the end of the day, even that diagram that I proposed, in which the Sharia is sovereign, this only applies to Muslim Ummah. It does not apply to other Ummah. You understand my point? So within the Muslim Ummah, we are, in a sense, covered by Muslim Sharia, by the law of Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad came with. And this has some, Ahl al-Dhimma comes into place, other issues come into place. So this is within within the framework of the Muslims. But when you're talking about others, then they can do it the way that they want. You got my point? So there are places which pertain to Muslims only, and there is an idea that can extend outside the the exclusivity of Muslims. And this is why I make the distinction between Muslim Ummah and Islamic Ummah. So the Islamic Ummah is wider and pluralistic. The exclusivity will be more within the Muslims.
Right. It also takes me to a different level of discussion where, sort of, if I may push this further, for example, in the political sphere, what we see right now is the whole secular liberal discourse crumbling down and crumbling down on its own feet of claiming being moral, democratic, pro-human rights. Mm-hmm. So imagining, while seeing that happening, and also while we live in a postmodern world, or some people say postmodern world. For example, John Baldry said that postmodern is the incredulity towards all meta-narratives. So there is no space of any meta-narrative. There is no space of any deen, if I may not use the word religion, mm-hmm. or religious discourse in the postmodern world. Like, thinking philosophically, what sort of language or what sort of approach do you think, while thinking again about the idea of Ummah, where the whole postmodern discourse is all about negating any space for any meta-narrative, while at the same time the nation-state discourse is so much overwhelming that there is no space of having this, even imagining this idea. So how do you look at it philosophically, if I may ask? If you could get the idea of what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, I mean, the absence of religion in the postmodern world, many people talked about it, and it's happening, right? You see it in the West. You have the rise of secular religion and, all of that. What I'm trying to do in my book is to challenge that. That's one thing. And I think the Muslim Ummah, because it's the last Ummah that came to mankind, and because it has a function, which is enjoining righteousness and deterring wrongness while believing in God, these come together. So when I mentioned today, for example, the demonstrations that are happening around the world, people are enjoining righteousness and deterring wrongness without believing in God, right? But the Muslims do it simultaneously. So to create the space of what you're saying about, other than writing and discussing it, Muslims need to implement it, right? Need to implement it for it to work. And I don't know if I answered, is that what you're, And also the other thing that I'm trying to do in my work, other than, the first half is focused on the Quran, like purely, right? And the historical. The second part is a discussion or a dialectic between the Quran and Aristotle, where in the West, Aristotle is, and actually in the West and in the East, is highly regarded as an important thinker. So by doing that, I'm introducing these ideas or putting them back into the discourse through Western terminology to make it understandable to the Western audience. I don't know if I answered your question or if
It was more than enough. If any of you have any questions, you're most welcome. And does anyone have any questions? If you have any questions, you're most welcome to ask. Okay. Nobody. Professor Katrin, it was amazing, and it was nice to host you. And we really love your book, and we would love to see more of your writings in future, inshallah. And we'd love to invite you to Istanbul Tar Center and host you, inshallah, in our center, inshallah, very soon. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be in touch, inshallah. If you have any final comments, you're most welcome.
Well, no, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the discussion. I appreciate it. And I hope I can come to Istanbul, inshallah, and talk more like in public with everyone.
Inshallah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.